Now beginning. Story 1. When Stones Spoke. The Dawn of Egyptian Board Games. In the breathless stillness of an early morning on the Nile's western banks, a scribe's reed pen scratches rhythmically over papyrus. Beyond the low murmur of the city, somewhere near the homes of lesser priests and administrators, a small group of children gather around a carved wooden board, their fingers tracing smooth depressions in its surface. The game they are playing is called Senet, and they may not know it yet, but their movements echo rituals thousands of years old. To understand how one of the earliest known board games came into being, one must begin not with the invention of fun, but with the development of order. Ancient Egypt was not simply born with pyramids and gold-lined sarcophagi. Its first great achievement was consistency of floods, of food, and of rules. This was a civilization in love with systems. From seasonal calendars to mortuary architecture, Egypt thrived not in novelty, but in repetition. And so, the appearance of Senet is less a tale of innovation than one of record-keeping, habit, and gradual ceremonial weight. It was not invented on a whim, but evolved from the margins of a society obsessed with structure. A game emerges from the clay. The earliest archaeological traces of board games in Egypt date to around 3100 BCE, at the very tail end of the pre-dynastic period. Boards made of simple wood or even etched into stone floors display a consistent 3 by 10 pattern of squares, 30 in total. While no accompanying instructions survive from that early era, it's clear these weren't mere decorations. Some are worn by repeated use, others accompanied by small tokens or sticks used for casting lots. Games in the ancient world were not leisure activities in the modern sense. They held meanings beyond entertainment. In Egypt, where gods governed not just heaven but the most minute details of irrigation or the placement of tomb inscriptions, nothing was truly just a game. Senet, letter 132F4, letter 13216, letter 133CF, letter 132AA, letter 13216, letter 133CF, likely began as a folk pastime, played by families using pebbles, scratched lines in the dust, and rules taught from one generation to the next. But it slowly gained official recognition. Tomb paintings show high officials and even pharaohs hunched over Senet boards. In time, it would be played not merely for joy, but as a metaphor for the soul's journey through the afterlife. Wooden boards and carved intentions. By the time of the Old Kingdom, c. 2686–2181 BCE, Senet had grown more elaborate. Surviving boards from the period are crafted with care-fine wood inlays, sliding drawers for game pieces, and delicate craftsmanship far beyond casual use. This isn't the Egypt of dramatic religious epiphanies or sweeping military campaigns. This is the Egypt of inventories. Boards were recorded, tokens were counted, everything had a proper place. It is this very sense of bureaucracy and monotony that allowed Senet to be preserved. Carved into the fabric of daily life, its design became a stable artifact of Egyptian identity. Many boards used pawns shaped like cones and spools, perhaps symbolic, but also functional. Players likely cast knucklebones or throwing sticks to determine moves, not unlike dice. Moves were governed by chance, but with strict procedural expectations. The gods enter the game. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, c. 2055–1650 BCE, Senet wasn't just a pastime, it had become spiritualized. The journey across the 30 squares came to represent the passage of the Ka, the soul, through Juet, the Egyptian underworld. Specific squares were marked with hieroglyphs representing various powers or trials: water, rebirth; the house of happiness, the house of 3 truths. Winning wasn't merely a matter of outmaneuvering one's opponent, it was symbolic of a successful transition to the afterlife. Inscriptions on tomb walls show deceased nobles playing Senet, often against invisible opponents, sometimes even against gods. The logic here is striking. Life was bureaucratic, structured, and dull. Death, too, needed clear procedures. Senet was a tutorial for eternity. And this is perhaps the most Egyptian detail of all, the very idea that one could practice the afterlife with enough preparation. One game, 100 interpretations. Despite its common appearance, Senet was never one thing. For some, it was a rainy season distraction. For others, it was preparation for death. For children, perhaps, it was just what you did when your father was inscribing tax returns and you weren't allowed near the livestock. But no matter its user, the game was a structure. And structures brought comfort. Even as dynasties fell and religious doctrines changed, the board remained. Carved wooden boxes survived in tombs as valuable funerary goods. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 4 Senet boards, one in ivory and ebony, richly adorned, proof that not even a boy king wanted to face the afterlife without a playable rulebook. Slow movements through a fast eternity. The pace of Senet was not brisk. Movements were deliberate, subject to the whims of chance but grounded in slow deliberation. And this too reflects Egyptian values. In a world dominated by river time, by the flooding and receding of the Nile, there was no rush. You moved piece by piece, square by square, through 30 steps of life and beyond. In a modern era obsessed with speed, the slowness of this board game feels almost radical. It's telling that Senet did not change much for 2,000 years. Unlike chess or Go, which evolved through conquest and complexity, Senet endured by resisting change. That was its beauty, and its boredom. Forgotten games, eternal boards. By the time of the Ptolemaic period, 305–30 BCE, Senet began to fade from common use. Hellenistic culture brought with it other games, new tastes, different rituals. But echoes of Senet remained in Egyptian iconography long after the last board was used. Even now, scholars debate the rules. The silence of millennia has left us with boards but no guidebooks, and that's what makes it all the more mysterious. Why did this game survive across dynasties, while others disappeared entirely? Why did a society so steeped in symbolism, routine, and practical survival choose to make this one activity sacred? And perhaps more hauntingly, what were the rules? The Egyptians did not view play as an escape from duty. Rather, they saw it as a mirror of order, a methodical practice of existence itself. So it is fitting that a game like Senet, often perceived today as a simple pastime, functioned more as an extension of Egyptian cosmology, statecraft, and personal preparation for the unknown. This was not mere recreation. It was ritual, record-keeping, and repetition, all within a box of 30 squares. When we last left off, we observed that the physical form of the game endured across centuries. But it is in the context of religion and administration, those twin pillars of ancient Egyptian civilization, that Senet grew from amusement into sacred metaphor. The bureaucracy of the beyond. The Egyptians were bureaucrats of the spirit. Every aspect of death required permits, permissions, and procedures. Tombs were not simply places to bury the dead, they were managed archives of a person's social rank, piety, and preparation for eternity. This mindset extended even to the games buried alongside the deceased. Senet was no exception. Within the carefully itemized inventories of tomb goods, the game appeared regularly by the Middle Kingdom, and its inclusion wasn't arbitrary. Many funerary inscriptions went so far as to request that the deceased be allowed to place Senet under the sycamore tree with the Lady of the West, a reference to Hathor, a goddess of music, fertility, and the afterlife. In this context, the board game became a kind of spiritual passport, a means to ensure safe passage through the duat. It was not just what one played in life, but what one hoped to continue in death. Game pieces and divine actors. Consider the pieces themselves. While the earlier versions were often simple and unadorned cones and spools, shaped from ivory, stone, or wood, later iterations began to take on stylized forms. Some sets included animal or human figures, though rarely with detailed expression. Symbolism mattered more than flair. The Egyptians believed strongly in Heka, or magical power, which could be bound into objects through ritual and inscription. As such, the game pieces were not merely tokens. They could become representations of the soul's journey, of divine agents, or even of protective forces. The act of playing wasn't passive, it was part invocation, part performance. Each piece, then, may have stood for an aspect of the self, or of celestial guardians, navigating through squares that represented trials, tribulations, or transformations. Square by square, mapping the afterlife. By the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, scholars believe that specific squares on the board held symbolic meanings, though not all surviving boards show these markings. The last 5 squares in particular came to be known as the houses of various spiritual states. Square 26, House of Rebirth. Square 27, House of Happiness. Square 28, House of Water. Square 29, House of Three Truths. Square 30, House of Ra. Some of these inscriptions survive on painted boards or in papyri, offering us cryptic clues to gameplay and meaning. What is clear is that these weren't just final destinations, they were stations of cosmic evaluation. The House of Water, for instance, could represent a trial or purifying event, perhaps a setback. The House of Rebirth implies progression, while the House of Ra, named for the sun god, may signal final transcendence. Imagine, then, an ancient Egyptian hunched over their board, counting spaces with a hand-worn token. Each move not just a step in strategy, but a symbolic rehearsal for the journey of the soul. Each opponent not merely a rival, but a reflection of the challenges one must overcome to reach the light. From noble game to sacred rite. By the time of the 18th dynasty, the game appears in funerary papyri such as the Book of the Dead. Specific spells describe the soul playing Senet as a necessary part of its trial. Tomb illustrations show the deceased engaging in the game, often a cross from a divine opponent, Osiris, for example, or an unnamed celestial scribe. These were not whimsical additions. In a civilization where the afterlife mirrored bureaucracy on Earth, the ability to understand, perform, and win at Senet was potentially as important as knowing the names of gates in the underworld, or how to recite protective spells. Some scholars suggest that priests may have included Senet lessons among their spiritual preparations, or even played ritual versions of the game during temple ceremonies. Though we cannot confirm this with certainty, it aligns with the Egyptian tendency to ritualize repeated actions, to imbue repetition with meaning. The game's quiet integration into society. Despite its lofty religious connotations, Senet remained a game of daily life. Unlike some sacred practices reserved for the elite or priestly class, boards have been found in homes of modest administrators and artisans. It's important to recognize how deeply embedded games like Senet were in the rhythm of society. They weren't hidden in temples, they were in courtyards, carved into roof tiles, drawn on walls. Board games like food or ink or linen were tools of civilization. They provided continuity, structure, and comfort. This is perhaps where modern understandings of ancient games fall short. Today, games are often separated into categories: strategic, spiritual, recreational. But in ancient Egypt, these distinctions did not exist. Playing Senet was all these things, simultaneously and without contradiction. Preservation by obscurity. As Senet grew more associated with death and divine passage, its popularity as a casual household game began to decline. The spiritualization of play tends to have this effect. What was once a relaxing pastime could become taboo, restricted, or viewed as too sacred for general use. By the late period of Egyptian history, around the 7th century BCE, there is far less evidence of Senet being used in daily life. Though boards still appear in tombs, their presence seems ceremonial rather than practical. The game becomes frozen, preserved more in artistic representation than in lived experience. No longer evolving, it eventually faded into obscurity. Modern reconstructions and the frustration of scholars. Today, historians and archaeologists have attempted to reconstruct the rules of Senet. The challenge, however, lies in its silence. Despite its long history, no surviving document explains the full gameplay mechanics. The best-known reconstruction comes from Timothy Kendall, whose decades of research into iconography and symbolism led to a playable modern version. Yet even he admits its speculative nature. Other researchers disagree with his interpretations, proposing alternate rule sets. It is a strange irony that one of the most durable games in human history, played for thousands of years across all classes and regions of a great civilization, should leave us no final instruction manual. We know the boards, we know the pieces, we know the likely goals and meanings, but the movement, how many spaces, which direction, what happens on square 28, that remains lost. And perhaps that is appropriate. For a culture that viewed the afterlife as a mystery of layered knowledge, perhaps not even modern minds are meant to fully decode the steps of the sacred game. The stillness of play. When you look at an ancient Senet board today, housed in a museum in London or Berlin or Cairo, it is often presented like any other artifact under glass, neatly labeled distant. But that board once lived. It was once the site of laughter, arguments, learning, and prayer. Someone carved it. Someone taught its rules. Someone played it for the 100th time, fingers resting on a spool-shaped piece, wondering whether a single throw would mean victory or delay. That's the story of Senet, not just as a religious object or historical curiosity, but as a window into the quiet, careful routines that made Egypt endure for millennia. Because behind every great monument, every golden mask and towering obelisk, was a society of rules and rituals, a place where even play had a purpose, even boredom had meaning. And that brings us to the inevitable question: what happens when the soul loses the game? In the Egyptian worldview, failure was not simply undesirable, it was dangerous. To lose one's place in the ritual order of things, whether through improper offerings, mispronounced prayers, or perhaps even a wrong move on a symbolic game board, meant risking cosmic instability. That's why losing at Senet, once it became entwined with beliefs about the afterlife, could have carried implications far beyond temporary embarrassment. This final section of the story explores the shadowy realm of spiritual loss and what the cessation of Senet might tell us about the end of an ancient worldview. It is the slow unraveling of play as a mirror of faith, and what happens when even the most sacred games fall silent. What did it mean to lose? In the earliest, pre-spiritual versions of Senet, losing likely meant little more than social frustration, a small defeat between neighbors or siblings. But once the game became embedded in the theology of death, loss took on heavier significance. Some Egyptologists argue that in its sacred form, Senet may not have allowed for losing in the traditional sense at all. The tomb art almost always shows the deceased either in the midst of play or having apparently succeeded. In this reading, the game serves not as a gamble, but as a formalized journey, one that the pious would inevitably complete, step by step, into light. Others disagree, suggesting that losing in Senet could symbolize the soul's failure to pass divine judgment. If one's ka did not navigate the board successfully, it might face delay, confusion, or even spiritual annihilation. And then there's the unsettling possibility that losing the game, whether in life or death, reflected the broader human condition. That even in a culture defined by order, some journeys simply failed to reach the end. Afterlife bureaucracy and the negative confession. To understand the stakes of Senet, one must consider it alongside the negative confession, a ritual in the Book of the Dead in which the soul must deny 42 sins before passing judgment. The soul had to say, "I have not stolen, I have not slain men and women, I have not uttered lies, and so on. It was a checklist, a kind of cosmic ledger. And just as each square on the Senet board represented a step toward transcendence, each denial was a square in a spiritual grid. Lose the game or fail the confession, and the result might be the same. Your heart weighed against the feather of mad truth, and devoured by the monstrous Amit if found wanting. The Egyptians didn't picture hell as eternal fire. They feared being forgotten. They feared failing to pass the gates. They feared not finishing the game. The fade of a ritual. But what happens when a culture's rituals no longer match its lived reality? As Egypt entered periods of foreign rule, the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans, the foundational beliefs of the state began to erode. The bureaucracy persisted, but the spiritual cohesion weakened. Gods were absorbed or sidelined. Temples were repurposed, and games like Senet gradually lost their theological significance. By the time of Roman Egypt, around the 1st century CE, Senet had all but vanished from common use. Other games, Greek Pedaia, Roman Ludus Latrincularum, became popular in the region. Their rules survive in more complete form. They were competitive, strategic, and disconnected from the soul. Even tombs stopped depicting Senet. It was no longer seen as necessary for eternity. The game had become, in effect, obsolete. It is one of history's small ironies. A game once used to guide souls through death itself could not survive the death of its culture. The uneventful disappearance. Unlike grand temples torn down by conquest or banned rituals suppressed by imperial decree, Senet disappeared quietly. There is no recorded decree forbidding it, no dramatic shift in iconography, no known outcry from priests or scribes. It simply faded, slowly, inevitably, the way familiar objects drift out of fashion when the world around them changes too fast. In that way, Senet's disappearance is eerily modern. So many of our own traditions, paper letters, analog clocks, bedtime prayers, are not forcibly removed. They're simply not passed down. They're replaced or simply forgotten. And in ancient Egypt, forgetting was worse than death. Modern resurrection attempts. Despite its fall, Senet remained buried literally. Its boards lay sealed in tombs, undisturbed by centuries of sand and time. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries unearthed these objects, they were struck by their beauty and mystery. Early Egyptologists tried to catalog the artifacts. Boards were measured, photographed, categorized, but few gave serious thought to how the game worked. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars like Timothy Kendall and R.C. Bell attempted reconstructions. Using painted boards, symbolic references in funerary texts, and comparisons to other ancient games, they proposed playable versions of Senet. These modern rules are, by necessity, guesswork. They imagine how pawns might move based on dice-like throws of casting sticks, how certain squares might send pieces back, or protect them, or allow a player to block an opponent. Some versions treat the game like a race, others as a tactical battle. None can say with certainty whether they've truly recaptured what the Egyptians intended. And perhaps they haven't. Because Senet, in its deepest form, may not be a game at all but a ritual journey, a symbolic rehearsal for the soul's departure from time. Echoes in modern play. Still, something about Senet survives. Its structure, the forward progression, the spiritual metaphor, the stakes is mirrored in countless modern games. Consider Snakes and Ladders, which originated in ancient India as a game of moral instruction, or Chutes and Ladders, its modern descendant, or even role-playing games where characters pass through trials toward transformation. Even today, we play games where reaching the final square means something more than winning. We still encode morality, fate, and chance into play. And that, too, is an inheritance from ancient systems like Senet. We may no longer believe that rolling a 5 on a stick toss will determine the fate of our soul, but the structure remains, and structure is what survives. Why remember a forgotten game? Why, in a world filled with wars, monuments, and epic rulers, should we focus so much on a game? Because games reveal how people thought, how they coped with mystery, how they found comfort in repetition, how they taught their children to prepare for life, and how they prepared themselves for death. Senet reminds us that even in a civilization famous for its pyramids and pageantry, the core of its culture lay in the quiet, deliberate acts of its people. Acts like moving a small wooden piece across a worn board, counting softly, hopping the next square is safe, that the soul continues, that order holds. The board at the end. Somewhere in a museum drawer or a forgotten tomb lies a Senet board whose game was never finished, a piece still mid-journey, a player gone before the final move. Perhaps that board is yours to imagine. And if you were to play slowly, silently, what might the squares say to you? Would you win? Would you lose? Or would you, like so many before, simply move through time? Hopping the board will carry you forward. Story 2, Salt and Silence, the monotonous life of a Roman tax collector. Imagine a road in the middle of the Roman Empire, not one of the grand highways lined with triumphal arches or watched by centurions in polished armor, but a more modest artery, beaten into dust by sandals, mule carts, and reluctant footsteps. Along this road walks a man, hunched under the weight of a leather ledger and a day's worth of coin. He is not a soldier, nor a senator. He is a publicanus, a Roman tax collector. He does not wear armor, but he is protected at least in theory by Rome's vast bureaucratic reach. He carries not a weapon, but wax tablets, styluses, and names etched into rosters. He does not conquer provinces, but he controls something just as important: the inflow of coin, grain, animals, and even salt that funded an empire. To understand the Roman Empire, you must understand its margins. Not the legions, not the emperors, not the orators, but the scribes and counters, the men who turned human labor into numbers and coin into empire. This is the story of one of them, the uncelebrated architect of order. The Roman Empire was, at its core, a tax machine. Its survival, especially after the expansionist republic transformed into a sprawling imperial state, depended on a steady stream of resources extracted from its provinces. But collecting those resources required organization, and organization required men like Publius Cestius Longinus, a name we'll borrow for this composite figure, drawn from letters, receipts, and legal documents preserved in brittle Latin. Publius likely did not come from wealth, but he was literate, a skill that lifted men from field to forum. Assigned to a small outpost in southern Gaul or Numidia, he managed the finances of a region not by sword, but by stylus. Each day, Publius dealt not with conquest but compliance. He balanced shipments of wheat owed by local farms. He assessed taxes levied not in coin, but in livestock, salt, or even pottery. He issued receipts stamped with lead seals. He filed reports on defaulters, negotiated payment delays, and sometimes called in soldiers when compliance waned. But mostly he waited. He waited for shipments, for ox carts, for local elders with excuses, for parchment from Rome. The mechanics of a quiet profession. The life of a Roman tax collector was a marathon of monotony. Before the fiscus, the emperor's central treasury, could be filled, thousands of men like Publius had to collect, record, and reconcile figures. He worked out of a stations, a kind of local tax office that may have occupied part of a villa or public building. His tools were simple: wooden tablets coated in wax, bronze styluses, abacuses, bags of pre-counted coins. For written communication, he used papyrus scrolls sealed with wax and thread. Most taxes were based on a census, a list of citizens, land holdings, and property updated at intervals. But this data was often outdated, especially in the provinces. The result? Publius spent much of his time comparing inconsistent lists, conducting verbal interviews, and walking long distances to inspect fields or grain stores. He had assistants scribi who helped with calculations and copywork. He may also have contracted redemptors, private tax farmers, to handle riskier or more difficult territories. In such cases, Publius became part administrator, part negotiator. His job was not exciting, but it was essential. Salt, tar, and inconvenient geography. Though coin was the most flexible currency, much of Roman taxation was paid in kind. That is, taxes were assessed and collected in the form of local goods. In some regions this meant grain, in others wine or oil, in coastal towns dried fish, and across much of the interior salt. Salt was a staple of Roman logistics, used to preserve food, tan leather, and even pay soldiers, hence the term salarium. Salt was both valuable and heavy. Transporting it required coordination. Publius had to manage these logistics with care. Ox carts could travel roughly 20 miles a day, depending on terrain. Roads could flood. Bandits could strike. Local disputes could erupt into delays. If salt spoiled or was diluted, as some unscrupulous suppliers might attempt, he had to inspect and report it. There is no evidence that Publius ever chased anyone down, but we know from preserved Roman correspondence that tax collectors often had to adjudicate strange cases: missing amphorae, stolen mules, corrupt middlemen, even accusations of false measurement stones. The work was not only dull, it could be dangerous. The silence of repetition. Despite the endless scrolls of Latin literature and oratory, the voices of tax collectors like Publius are almost entirely silent in the historical record. They were not poets. They did not carve inscriptions to themselves. Their legacy is bureaucratic: wooden tablets with names and numbers, lost in deserts or rivers, recovered centuries later by accident. From these artifacts we glimpse the world Publius inhabited, a world of constant measurement, of weighing barley, of counting goats, of checking the yield of olive presses against what was reported, a world of tedium that masked a fragile system of imperial finance. When something went wrong, when harvests failed, or shipments disappeared, it was men like Publius who had to explain the shortfall, who absorbed the anger of villagers and the skepticism of imperial auditors alike. And when something went very wrong, such as the temporary collapse of trade routes or the rebellion of a provincial governor, his life could be in danger. But most of the time, there was just silence. The art of staying unnoticed. Tax collectors did not live in mansions. Their success was defined by invisibility. A good collector caused no scandal, underreported no quotas, and avoided being the subject of local petitions. Publius likely rented a small room in the village where he worked, ate with local dignitaries or visiting officials, and kept detailed personal notes, copies of reports, ledgers, and complaints in case he needed to defend himself later. He may have had a family, or he may not. He may have visited Rome once or twice in his life, but likely remained stationed far from the capital, his labor consumed in maintaining the invisible architecture of Roman rule. He did not shape history with speech or battle, but without him grain would not move, coin would not be minted, legions would not be paid. Dull work, fragile empire. What the story of Publius reveals is not just the function of tax collectors, but the fragility of empire. The Roman system depended not just on the will of emperors or the strength of the military, but on the regular, tedious, and often thankless work of minor officials. If Publius erred in his tallies, if shipments failed to arrive, if locals grew too resentful of his presence, the system could buckle. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, bureaucratic rust growing over centuries. And yet, despite the risk, there is no indication that Publius thought of himself as important. He was a worker, a cog, a man who measured weight by hand, adjusted for theft, double-checked invoices, and carried the burden of empire one cartload at a time. So what becomes of a man like Publius when the empire begins to strain? Does he survive, adapt, move on? Or is he quietly swept away by the very silence he served? The tax collector's life was an empire in miniature, bounded by deadlines, receipts, and the fine balance between being too visible and too forgettable. Where we last left Publius Cestius Longinus, our composite Roman publicanus, he was making his rounds along the quiet roads of the provinces, ledger in hand, measuring grain, weighing salt, and filing meticulous notes into the imperial machine. But beneath the tedium of his daily tasks lay a growing complexity. Loyalty to Rome did not always align with survival in the provinces. Corruption wasn't a failure of the system, it was part of its lubrication. And in a world powered by imperial expectation and local resistance, Publius's job became less about collecting taxes and more about managing risk, keeping the numbers in line. Publius was not just a collector, he was a bookkeeper, a manager of expectations. Every denarius he recorded had to match up against not just local payments, but Rome's ever-expanding fiscal appetite. Taxes in the empire were rarely standardized. Each region had its own assessment system based on land value, tributum soli, personal wealth, tributum capitis, or special product taxes, portoria, customs duties. Sometimes, entire communities paid their dues as a collective civitate stipendiarii, forcing Publius to navigate both public declarations and internal politics. Every coin, every measure of barley, every salted fish had to be recorded in triplicate, one for local records, one for the regional administrator, and one for transmission to Rome. And mistakes cost reputation, or worse. The audit that never sleeps. The Roman state loved paper. Not literal paper, they used wax tablets, papyrus, and parchment, but metaphorical paper forms, tallies, tables, stamps. Publius's greatest fear was not bandits or angry villagers, but an inspectio, a fiscal audit dispatched from the praefectus Annani, or even from the emperor's own staff. These inspections could be sudden, brutally thorough. A discrepancy between reported taxes and actual yield could lead to demotion, public shame, or even legal action. Publius lived with the awareness that an error might be found years after he'd made it, or that someone might blame him for a discrepancy caused by another official. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty in Roman administration. Punishments were swift, especially if Rome's coffers were light. So he checked and rechecked his ledgers, cross-referenced shipments, copied his records obsessively, stored duplicates in sealed jars, some of which archaeologists still recover today. Bribes, the unspoken line item. Despite the formality, corruption was common. Bribes could smooth over shipping delays, adjust assessments, or buy silence when a farmer was missing a shipment. Publius was no fool. He knew how to accept gifts without accepting guilt. A few baskets of figs here, a night's lodging upgraded by a local villa owner there, a gold ring in a sealed pouch never acknowledged, always remembered. There were limits. Rome tolerated minor graft, especially in distant provinces, as long as quotas were met. But excessive extortion or neglect could lead to swift consequences, not always from the state, but from the people. Some tax collectors were murdered, others were run out of towns. A few were reported by rival officials eager for advancement. Survival meant knowing how much to take, how much to give, and when to walk away. Navigating resistance. Taxation was not just economic, it was political. Many communities resented Roman rule, and the tax collector embodied it. In Gaul, Judea, and Egypt especially, tax revolts were not uncommon. Publius might arrive in a village to find shutters closed, roads accidentally blocked, officials missing. He had to interpret silence as threat or negotiation. He learned to speak local dialects, to understand when a delay was a stall tactic, and when it was a warning. In Judea, tax collectors like Publius were openly despised, associated with betrayal, impurity, and Rome's occupation. Some operated with armed escorts. Others relied on loyal local intermediaries, a risky but sometimes necessary arrangement. To be effective, Publius had to balance Rome's demands with local tolerance, push too hard and revolt brewed, be too lenient and suspicion fell upon him from above. The price of bread and olive oil. Amid all of this, the actual taxes remained depressingly mundane. Publius often calculated yields of wheat per jugerum of land. He monitored the weight and purity of olive oil. He counted amphorae loaded onto ships headed for Rome's Horia, the massive grain warehouses. Some taxes were seasonal, sheep in spring, wine in autumn. Others came irregularly, emergency levies to fund military campaigns or cover grain shortages. One particular headache was coinage. Roman mints varied in quality, and inflation or coin debasement meant Publius sometimes had to adjust for devalued currency. A tax paid in solid coin was worth more than one paid in clipped or counterfeit denarii. These complexities weren't theoretical, they were constant. Each day was a negotiation of numbers, faces, weights, and pressure. Personal isolation in an imperial role. For all his responsibility, Publius lived alone socially and politically. He was neither fully Roman nor fully local in most provinces. To the empire, he was a servant. To the people, a parasite. He kept a tight circle, perhaps one or two trusted scribes, a local cook, maybe an interpreter. He might have children born in the provinces half Roman, half local who never set foot in the capital. Or he might send money back to a distant family, keeping them safe from the tensions of frontier life. Publius was deeply aware of his impermanence. He could be reassigned, replaced, forgotten. So he saved, kept his scrolls clean, avoided gossip, wrote carefully worded letters to superiors, never made enemies he didn't need to. The long shadow of the empire's ledger. The further Rome spread, the more it depended on men like Publius, quietly competent, quietly corruptible, quietly expendable. They were the ones who made conquest profitable. For centuries, this system endured. Even as emperors changed and legions marched and gods came and went, the bureaucracy of taxation remained steady. Until it didn't. Because what no audit could track was the slow erosion of compliance, the fraying of trust, the growing costs of enforcement. The complexity of empire was beginning to exceed the capacity of men like Publius. But the fall would not come in fire or proclamation. It would come in silence. So how long can an empire survive on ledgers and loyalty alone? And what happens to the man who keeps the numbers when the numbers stop adding up? The Roman Empire is often remembered for its grand spectacles, its legions crossing frontiers, its emperors assassinated in marble palaces, its cities erupting in revolt or fire. But for the vast majority of the people who lived under its shadow, the fall didn't come with the sound of swords or crumbling walls. It came with missed shipments, with ledgers that no longer balanced, with a bureaucrat like Publius Cestius Longinus, sitting by a flickering oil lamp, pen in hand, waiting for a tax that would never arrive. This final section follows the slow disintegration of the systems that men like Publius held together for centuries, not through failure or treason, but through the sheer weight of imperial complexity and the diminishing returns of control. The weight of inertia. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was groaning under its own expectations. What was once a lean republic with flexible administration had grown into a labyrinth of overlapping jurisdictions, inconsistent currencies, and ever-expanding needs. And the tax collector felt it all. Publius or someone like him now had more paperwork, not less. Reforms introduced under emperors like Diocletian attempted to make taxation more efficient, but in practice, They required even more detailed assessments, more intrusive data collection, and more rigid accountability. No longer just a manager, Publius had become a statistician, a census official, a state enforcer. The job wasn't growing, it was bloating. And the more that was demanded from provinces, the harder it became to collect anything at all. A world of declining returns. Inflation was another invisible enemy. Rome's currency had once been the most trusted in the world, but by the late empire, coins were debased, clipped, or hoarded. The silver denarius was largely replaced by bronze and base metal coinage. Publius might find that the same amount of tax in name now brought in half the actual purchasing power. He would revise his tables, raise his assessments, and immediately face protest. Grain had to be collected in larger volumes to match declining values. Oxen were taxed at higher rates. Salt quotas increased. But the peasantry had nothing more to give, and Publius had no room to adjust. The breaking point of compliance. In small towns across the empire, resistance became passive. Villages disappeared from tax rolls. Entire communities migrated into the forests or hills, out of sight and beyond enforcement. Publius filed reports of missing households or partial compliance. He sent requests for military assistance that were delayed, denied, or simply ignored. Soldiers were stretched thin, used to guard borders or suppress open rebellions elsewhere. He was, in effect, left alone. Even when escorted, the soldiers who accompanied him were poorly paid and underfed. They resented guard duty and sometimes took bribes to look the other way. The fear of Roman retaliation, once a defining force in the provinces, began to fade. And when fear fades, taxes stop flowing. Local substitutions and shadow economies. In the absence of imperial support, provinces began solving problems on their own. Local magistrates paid taxes in place of villagers to avoid audits. Others forged documents or bribed collectors to underreport yields. Publius found himself navigating these makeshift systems, negotiating informal exchanges, tolerating discrepancies he once would have flagged. He might receive livestock instead of coin, cloth instead of grain, or nothing at all, just a promise that someone else had already paid. At some point, he stopped asking questions, because his job was no longer to enforce Rome's laws. It was to survive within them. Paper empires and phantom revenues. Officially, the empire still functioned. Reports were filed, taxes were recorded, but the numbers were increasingly fiction. This paper empire, as modern historians call it, relied on the illusion of control. Every office did its part, repeating rituals of bureaucracy, documenting compliance that wasn't happening. Publius copied totals from the previous year, adjusting them slightly to match expectations. His supervisors likely did the same. Entire regions may have existed in Rome's records that, in reality, had emptied of taxable labor decades earlier. The state had become a spreadsheet with no basis in reality. And the tax collector, once the most tangible representative of imperial power, now served a ghost. Anonymity as safety. By now, Publius knew better than to draw attention. Promotions brought scrutiny. Complaints invited investigation. Staying where he was, keeping his reports passable, and disappearing into routine became his greatest protection. He may have taken a local spouse. He may have adopted provincial customs. He may have quietly transferred funds into a safe place, just in case. In a world where Rome was becoming an abstraction, men like Publius turned inward. Their loyalty was no longer to the empire but to routine, to survival, to silence. When the letters stopped coming, there is no final record of Publius's end, but perhaps one day the letters stopped coming. The shipments failed entirely. The military posts nearby were abandoned. The roads became dangerous even in daylight. Perhaps he locked his office one final time, or maybe he fled in the night. Or maybe he stayed, old and stooped, reading old records aloud like prayers until he was the last Roman official in a land that no longer remembered what that meant. And no one noticed when he was gone. The empire's quiet exit. When we speak of the fall of Rome, we often imagine cities in flames, barbarians at the gates, marble statues pulled down and melted into coin. But most of Rome fell like Publius did, quietly, bureaucratically, through the exhaustion of a system too complex to sustain itself. Salt stopped moving. Ledgers stopped updating. And somewhere, the last tax was never collected. No proclamation, no funeral. Just a chair left empty. Why this story matters. Publius's story isn't dramatic. It's not filled with battles or betrayals, but that's what makes it so important. Empires don't just rise and fall through the will of generals or emperors. They endure or collapse through the daily work of ordinary people, through supply chains, payrolls, road repairs, and yes, tax collectors. The decline of Rome wasn't a thunderclap. It was a quiet subtraction of order. One missed shipment at a time. One unread letter. One empty ledger. And one man carrying the empire on his back until it simply faded away. Story 3, Needles in the Wind, the Persian postal network that shaped an empire. In the vast sweep of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, stretching from the edges of Greece to the mountains of modern Pakistan, communication could have been its greatest weakness. After all, an empire lives or dies not just by conquest, but by what comes after: governance, administration, response. Yet the Persians, so often remembered only through Greek eyes as exotic or despotic, understood this long before their rivals. They built not only cities and tombs, but something far more enduring: a postal system. Before the Romans codified their own networks, before the Mongols rode across Asia, the Persians were binding their empire together with roads, rest stations, and an elaborate relay system that, for its time, was a marvel of dull brilliance. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast by modern standards, but it worked. And like many of history's most important ideas, its success was measured in its silence. A message from Susa. Let's begin in Susa, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. It's the 5th century BCE. A clay tablet bearing a royal seal is pressed into a leather pouch and handed to a mounted courier. He is not a soldier. He is not a noble, but he holds power nonetheless. His name is forgotten, one of many, but his job is clear. Deliver this message to Sardis, nearly 1,700 miles away. And he will not do it alone. He will ride hard for one day, no more. Then he will hand the pouch to another rider at a station. That rider will repeat the process, and another, until the message reaches its end. This is the Angarium, the royal courier system. It is not glamorous. It is not well documented outside of passing references by Greek historians. But it is what kept an empire from collapsing under its own weight. The royal road, an artery for administration. To understand the Persian postal system, you must understand the royal road. Spanning from Susa to Sardis, this road, nearly 2,700 kilometers in length, cut through plains, deserts, mountains, and river valleys. It wasn't a single road so much as a stitched-together route of older paths, improved and maintained under the reign of Darius I, R 522-486 BCE. The road wasn't built for armies, though they used it. It wasn't built for merchants, though they profited from it. It was built for messages, for control. Every 20-30 kilometers, rest stations were constructed, modest buildings with food, water, fresh horses, and lodging. These relay posts, or chaparkane, enabled the empire's most important officials to communicate with staggering speed. Messages could travel the full length of the royal road in 7-9 days, where ordinary travel might take 90. This was not due to magic, it was due to management. Chapars, the unseen arteries of empire. The riders of this network were known as chapars. They were not elite warriors, nor were they simply messengers. They were state employees, part of a managed system of logistics that reflected the Achaemenid talent for bureaucratic structure. Each chapar carried an insignia, marking him as part of the system. He could requisition fresh horses at stations. He had the right of way. Local satraps' governors were expected to accommodate them. An obstruction of a chapar was punishable as a threat to the king's authority. But the chapars themselves had little prestige. They were, like Publius in the Roman world, important precisely because they were invisible. They moved in silence, through wind and rain, through sandstorms and river crossings. They were, in Herodotus' words, unstoppable. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed. Sound familiar? That line, etched into the U.S. Postal Service's headquarters 2,400 years later, comes directly from this ancient system. Packages of power. So what did they carry? Not love letters or shopping lists. The Angarium was for official messages only: royal decrees, tax records, military orders, census data, appointments of officials, complaints against satraps, notices of revolt. Some messages were engraved on clay, others written on parchment or leather. All were sealed, sometimes with wax, sometimes with metal, and marked by the sender. The messages themselves were less important than the fact that they moved. Without the postal system, the King of Kings in Persepolis would be blind to a famine in Egypt, or a rebellion in Babylon, or the need for reinforcements in Bactria. With it, he had eyes everywhere. The hidden infrastructure. The road and its riders were supported by invisible labor: grooms who cared for the horses, cooks who prepared meals at rest stations, builders who maintained the roads, and scribes who tracked shipments. None of these roles were glamorous. They appear in no royal inscriptions, but they made the system function. The Persian Empire wasn't just rich. It was connected not by ideology or shared language, but by logistics. A shoemaker in Ecbatana could be paid because taxes arrived on time. A governor in Lydia could receive new orders before his province unraveled. A temple in Babylon could be rebuilt with permission that arrived, incredibly, just in time. This is the power of boring systems. Quiet efficiency in a chaotic world. Compared to the Greek city-states, where communication was erratic and slow, the Persian system seemed miraculous. The Greeks viewed it with awe and suspicion. How could a government so large maintain such order? But the answer was simple: they delegated. Satraps had authority, but they were accountable because the post arrived. Local communities managed supplies for stations, but were funded because the records flowed. The king was distant, but ever-present because his voice could travel. This system didn't rely on brute force, it relied on routine. And routine, as always, is the foundation of empires. Beyond the road. Though the royal road is most famous, the Persian postal network extended far beyond it. Routes fanned out toward Egypt, India, the Persian Gulf, and the Caspian Sea. Each region adapted the system to local geography: riverboats in Mesopotamia, camel relays in the desert, even mountain runners in the Zagros. It wasn't uniform, but it was coherent. And that made it stronger than any army. So what happens when a message never arrives? What cracks begin to form when the road is washed out, the relay station abandoned, the chapar never relieved? Can an empire this large survive even a brief pause in its communication? We left the last courier galloping west along the royal road, his pouch sealed, the message inside destined for a satrap on the far edge of the Achaemenid world. Each hoofbeat pulled the empire tighter, Each station passed reaffirmed Persian dominance not through violence, but through communication. But roads wear down, horses tire, stations go unstaffed, and eventually every system faces strain. The Persian postal network was a marvel, yes, but not a miracle. It had limits, and when it failed, even briefly, the silence could echo louder than any sword. A system in motion. To understand what happens when a network strains, we must first look at how it was sustained. Unlike the later Roman cursus publicus, which developed into a centralized, sprawling logistical bureaucracy, the Persian Angarium was more flexible yet equally demanding. Each relay station had to maintain a stable of horses, rotated for rest and readiness, a supply of water and food, especially across arid regions, staff often drawn from local populations, including grooms, cooks, stable hands, and scribes, lodging for when weather, injury, or delay made overnight stays unavoidable. And perhaps most importantly, loyalty. The entire system relied on locals who were not Persian in culture, often not even subjects willingly, yet they participated in the daily functioning of the network, sometimes through incentive, sometimes through coercion, but always somehow through continuity. The fragility of roads. The royal road crossed more than just terrain. It passed through the boundaries of cooperation, language, weather, and tribal allegiance. Flooding could destroy a section of the road and delay messages by days. Sandstorms could bury way stations. Mountain snow could trap riders. But more insidious were the human interruptions. In regions of unrest, local villagers might block access to rest stations. Minor rebellions might go unreported for days or weeks because the network could no longer carry the king's message. In some cases, messages were intercepted, courier seals broken, pouches altered, information weaponized. Even a system that seemed unstoppable could be fractured by a single missing link. And in an empire that depended so heavily on presence through post, that missing link could lead to overreaction or worse, no reaction at all. When time becomes the enemy. For the satraps and governors spread across the empire, information was oxygen. The longer a message took to arrive, the greater the ambiguity, and in ambiguity, power shifted. Imagine a local governor in Lydia receives no orders for a month. A minor revolt flares. Should he act independently, wait for orders, write again? In this vacuum, trust eroded. Some governors began to anticipate royal policy, making decisions in the king's name that had not yet been authorized. Others withheld messages, altogether filtering information to shape their standing or delay bad news. The strength of the Angarium was its reliability. Its weakness was that when it failed, suspicion bloomed. The burden of accuracy. The further a message traveled, the more it was subject to translation, interpretation, or corruption. Many scribes were bilingual or trilingual necessary in an empire with dozens of regional languages, but few were infallible. A miswritten number in a tax report could trigger unwarranted punishment. A mistranslated order might delay military aid. The Persians did attempt quality control. Seals were monitored. Scribes were held to high standards. Courier training was strict. But even the best system cannot outrun human fallibility. And when the message was sacred, delivered in the name of the King of Kings, errors weren't just costly. They were dangerous. Control by visibility. The Persian postal network wasn't just about efficiency. It was also about visibility. Each courier who arrived in a village was a reminder: the empire sees you. It wasn't the same as Roman garrisons or Greek civic festivals. It was subtler, a persistent presence that connected the periphery to the core. But as the empire expanded, this visibility stretched thin. The more outposts added to the network, the more resources it required. Darius's successors, like Xerxes and Artaxerxes, attempted to preserve the infrastructure, but each generation brought new challenges: wars with Greece, revolts in Egypt, infighting at court. And every new crisis drew resources away from maintenance. Eventually, some roads became dusty tracks. Some rest stations were manned by aging workers or closed entirely. The needle that once pierced through the empire so precisely began to bend. The ghost messages. By the late 4th century BCE, as the Achaemenid Empire weakened, stories emerged of messages that never arrived, orders lost, updates delayed, false confirmations. Some regions operated on assumptions old policies, long since rescinded, enforced out of habit or confusion. And perhaps more hauntingly, some couriers kept riding, unaware that the message they carried no longer mattered. When Alexander the Great began his campaign against Persia, this system was still in place but frayed. He exploited it, captured stations, intercepted messages, redirected supply routes. It wasn't just that Alexander had speed or force. It was that the Angarium no longer held. And when the thread snaps, the fabric unravels. Legacy in dust. Yet the system's very structure influenced what came after. The Seleucid Empire, inheriting much of Persia's infrastructure, reused portions of the road. The Romans, later still, adopted many principles of the Persian model, especially in the use of relay stations and official couriers. Even in decline, the Angarium left an imprint. The idea that control is not enforced by distance, but by message. And centuries later, when Herodotus penned his now famous praise of the couriers, it wasn't exaggeration. It was the quiet recognition that before great empires collapse in flame, they first flicker in silence. So what happens when the last courier stops riding? When the road still exists, but no one remembers what it was built for? Can memory itself become a message too late delivered? The horse has stopped. The rest station is empty. The leather pouch once sealed with the royal insignia lies unopened, gathering dust beside the fire pit. No new rider arrives. No message continues its journey. Somewhere along the royal road, the system has fallen quiet. There is no announcement, no decree to mark the end of the Angarium. And yet it ends. This final section traces not just the decline of the Persian postal network, but its legacy, how its quiet rhythms shaped future empires, and how a system so ordinary, so mechanical, became one of the most influential forgotten tools in history. The road endures, the riders fade. When Alexander the Great began his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire in 334 BCE, he encountered not chaos but structure. Persian administrators were still keeping ledgers. Couriers still moved between cities. Roads remained passable, albeit in poor repair in certain regions. He used the roads, repurposed the stations, and retained many of the scribes. He didn't destroy the system. He inherited it. That's how robust it was. But even so, the cultural glue that held the Angarium together was cracking. The authority of the King of Kings was essential to the network's integrity. Without centralized power and consistent administrative oversight, way stations became informal inns. Riders became merchants. Messages stopped being state directives and became private contracts or rumors. The infrastructure lingered, the meaning evaporated. In the end, the network's greatest strength, its dependence on a unified state, became its greatest weakness. A memory that shaped the world. Though the Angarium ceased operation with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, its model survived in spirit. The Seleucids and Parthians kept elements of the system alive. Later, the Romans developed their own version, the cursus publicus, a state-run courier network with fresh horses and relay stations, established under Augustus. Unlike the Angarium, which had largely served the needs of the king and his satraps, the cursus publicus also accommodated provincial governors, judges, and military officials. It was broader in usage, but rooted in the same philosophy. The message defines the empire. Much later, the Mongols would refine similar networks during the 13th century, building their own stations across the vast Mongol Empire. Even the modern postal service, in its slow bureaucracy and dependable structure, owes something to the dusty hooves of Persian couriers. It is a legacy not of speed, but of reliability. Empire as routine. For every courier riding through wind and rain, there were dozens more in support. Shoemakers, leatherworkers, cooks, stable hands, carpenters, scribes. These people lived ordinary lives. They didn't think of themselves as part of a grand system, but they were. This is the real lesson of the Persian postal network. Empires are sustained not by ideology or conquest, but by routine. By meals prepared on time. By roads repaired before winter. By a horse waiting at the right post on the right day. When these routines hold, empires can endure war, succession crises, even defeats. When they fray, when the message fails, the empire begins to hollow from within. The final couriers. We do not know who delivered the last official message of the Angarium. There is no record of the final dispatch, no note that says, "This system ends today." Perhaps the final courier didn't even realize it was the last ride. Perhaps he passed through deserted stations, left his pouch on a stone table, and waited in vain for the next rider. Or perhaps the system simply faded into commerce couriers turning into private messengers, the road becoming a trade route, the stations becoming homes. And yet, centuries later, when the Sassanids revived Persian power, and again when Islamic caliphates sought to administer vast lands, the idea of a relay system re-emerged. The memory of movement remained. The path, once carved into the empire's skin, was never fully forgotten. The irony of silence. It is ironic that the most effective tool of the Persian Empire, a tool praised by outsiders like Herodotus, was not one of conquest or divine will, but of organization. It was boring, predictable, administrative. And it made the empire work. No monument was ever built to honor a chapar. No songs were sung of the men who kept the couriers fed, the horses shoed, the seals unbroken. And yet without them, the king's word would have meant nothing. A reflection in modern systems. Today, the idea of instant communication is taken for granted. A message can cross the globe in seconds. But the reliability, the structure, the trust in a system that's a much older inheritance. Every overnight delivery, every barcoded scan, every dispatch from a central office to a distant branch echoes the logic of the Angarium. Even now, empires digital or political depend on the principles Darius once enforced. That distance is not an excuse for ignorance. That speed without structure is useless. That a message, delivered on time, can be more powerful than an army. And that behind every such message, there is a person you've never heard of doing their job. The message delivered. The message carried over centuries, lost and rediscovered is this. An empire is only as strong as its most forgettable servant. A road is only useful if someone rides it. A king is only mighty if his words arrive. The Persian postal system may be gone, but its shadow rides on. Story 4. The Monk and the Menu, Daily Eating Habits in a 10th Century Monastery. The bell rings. Not loudly, not harshly, but with a steady rhythm that slices through the cold, moist air of a stone cloister in 10th century France. It's the fourth bell of the day. The monks rise silently, without hesitation. They do not speak, and they do not look at one another. They have heard this bell every day of their adult lives. It is time to eat. The story of medieval monasticism is often told through prayer, architecture, or illuminated manuscripts. But beneath the chanting and the copying, a different story unfolds, one of food. of beans soaked overnight, of black bread slowly baked, of small portions and endless repetition. This is the story of eating without indulgence. In the heart of the monastery, food was a rhythm, not a pleasure. It was a ritual, a survival mechanism, and a deeply symbolic practice, tightly bound by religious discipline, agricultural cycles, and the mechanics of early medieval life. The rule that governed the spoon. To understand how monks ate, we begin with the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century CE, but dominant throughout Western Christendom by the 10th. Chapter 39 of the rule concerns itself with food. We think it sufficient for the daily dinner, whether at the 6th or the 9th hour, that there be at all the meal's 2 cooked dishes. If fruit or fresh vegetables are available, a 3rd dish may be added. It was modest, it was regulated, and it was unchanging. The monks were not fasting in the extreme sense; they were fed regularly. But they ate within strict limits, shaped by obedience, humility, and the conviction that gluttony was a spiritual hazard. Thus, every aspect of eating, from what was grown to how it was prepared to, when it was served, was dictated by rules, bells, and custom. Meals by the bell, the daily structure. In most Benedictine monasteries of the 10th century, meals were taken twice a day, once around midday prandium, and once in the early evening cena, depending on the season. During Lent and Advent and on many feast days, only one meal might be permitted, and sometimes none at all. No matter the day, the process was orderly. The bell. A monk rang the refectory bell at the designated hour. The procession. Monks filed in silently, in strict order of seniority. The seating. They sat along stone benches or wooden tables, all facing the same direction, usually toward the reader's lectern. The reading. One monk read aloud from a religious text, often the Bible, hagiographies, or moral commentaries, while the others ate in silence. The blessing. A prayer before and after the meal, sometimes led by the abbot himself. Monks were not permitted to speak during meals. Any communication was done through sign language, a system of codified gestures developed to maintain silence while still requesting more bread or indicating the need for water. What did they actually eat? Though rules were clear, the specifics of the menu depended on the region, the monastery's wealth, and the time of year. But certain elements remained constant. Baguette bread. Bread was the staple. Monks consumed coarse black bread made from rye, barley, or spelt. White bread made with refined wheat was rare and often reserved for the abbot or special guests. Monasteries typically had their own bakeries. The daily portion might be 1 pound of bread per monk, weighed precisely before being served. Bowl with spoon, beans and legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, and peas formed the protein base of most meals. These were stewed, often with onions, garlic, and herbs grown in the monastery's kitchen garden, hortus. On fasting days, legumes were the main course, eaten slowly, with little salt. Cheese, wedge cheese, and dairy. Though discouraged during Lent, dairy products were otherwise allowed. Monks ate soft cheeses, yogurt-like curds, and sometimes butter, though olive oil was preferred when available. Milk, however, was limited and often reserved for the sick or elderly. Broccoli, vegetables, and fruits. The kitchen garden produced cabbage, leeks, carrots, beets, and turnips. Apples, pears, and plums were dried and stored for the winter. Vegetables were boiled into thin soups, served warm and often bland. Fish. Meat was generally forbidden. Fish, however, was a permissible exception. In coastal or river monasteries, fresh fish was common. Inland, dried or salted fish was eaten sometimes daily. Fish was both a protein source and a loophole. Even large aquatic animals like beavers or barnacle geese were occasionally classified as fish to allow for consumption. No knives at the table. Cutlery was minimal. Most monks used only a wooden spoon, their bread acting as a substitute for a plate. Knives were discouraged, associated with violence and vanity. Each monk brought a cloth napkin, tucked into his robes. Personal utensils were considered improper. Everything tools, plates, even spoons belonged to the monastery. The monastic kitchen, a sacred machine. The kitchen was run not by the abbot, but by the cellarer, a senior monk responsible for provisioning, storage, and distribution. He kept the keys to the food stores, ordered grain deliveries, and monitored waste. The kitchen was located away from the dormitories to avoid the smell of boiling legumes or burning bread. Fires were carefully managed, with rotating monks assigned to cooking duties on a weekly or monthly basis. Cooking wasn't glamorous. It was considered manual labor, on par with farming or cleaning. Yet the quality of the food depended entirely on the monk assigned to the stove that week. Food as spiritual discipline. The purpose of eating for monks was not pleasure. It was sustenance for prayer and work. Gluttony was viewed not just as a sin, but as a distraction from discipline. Portions were intentionally small. Seconds were rare. Sweetness was almost entirely absent. Spices were expensive, and meals were bland by design. Even the structure of the dining room reinforced discipline. The refectory was austere stone walls, long tables, no artwork, no decoration. It wasn't supposed to feel like a reward. It was part of the monk's path toward humility and detachment from worldly pleasure. When rules are bent. Of course, monasteries weren't immune to pragmatism or temptation. Monasteries that grew wealthy often interpreted the rule of Saint Benedict more loosely. By the 10th century, some monks enjoyed multiple dishes, frequent fish, and small luxuries like honey or imported oil. In wealthier communities, meals might include almond milk, spiced vegetable stews, or light pastries baked on feast days. Still, the basic pattern held. Eating was bound by schedule, silence, and symbolism. So what happens to a man who eats the same meal every day for 40 years? What becomes of hunger when it is no longer physical? And where is the line between routine and reverence? The cloister is quiet. Outside, the wind carries the faint scent of earth and wet stone, but inside the walls of the monastery, the world has shrunk to its ancient rhythm: prayer, labor, silence, and food. The monk rises from his bed before the sun, chants matins by candlelight, tills the soil before prime, copies scripture by sext, and eats, always without pleasure, because in the rule there is no indulgence. Yet within the rigid boundaries of the monastery's rule-bound world, food continues to evolve. It must, because the body hungers, the weather changes, the fields fail, and sometimes even monks long for something more than beans and bread. This section explores how 10th century monasteries adapted the strict dietary rules of their faith to the shifting realities of monastic life when necessity, abundance, or cunning gave rise to culinary loopholes, quiet indulgences, and carefully managed contradictions. The season of denial, Lent, and the monastic fast. If a normal monastic diet was plain, Lent made it plainer still. Lent, a 40-day period of fasting and penance before Easter, was perhaps the most challenging part of the monastic calendar. During this time, the rules grew stricter. Only one meal per day, usually after Vespers. No animal products at all. This meant not only meat, but also eggs, milk, butter, and cheese. Even olive oil was restricted in some communities, replaced by watery stews or thin porridge. Meals were diminished in size, with more emphasis on bread and legumes. This wasn't symbolic, it was physiological. Many monks lost weight during Lent. Some became ill from protein deficiency or cold, but fasting was believed to purify the soul, to sharpen the senses, to draw one closer to God through the dullness of the flesh. Monks didn't complain, at least not aloud. The curious case of the aquatic meat. One of the most famous culinary loopholes in monastic history was the classification of beavers as fish. Yes, beavers. Because they lived in water and had scaly tails, some monastic authorities deemed them acceptable during Lent. This interpretation may seem absurd, but it reflects a deeper pattern in monastic practice: the drive to reconcile rigid doctrine with material survival. Other aquatic animals received similar treatment. Barnacle geese, which were believed to grow on driftwood or seaweed, were considered fish and therefore permitted during fasts. Otters and even porpoises were occasionally eaten under the same justification. These weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of adaptation. The monks followed the letter of the rule, if not always its spirit. The abbot's table. While monks ate simple meals, the abbot, the head of the monastery, often had access to better fare. Not out of gluttony, but out of hospitality. Monasteries frequently hosted guests, pilgrims, nobles, bishops, even kings. To honor them, the abbot maintained a guest table where more refined dishes were served. This included roasted fish with herbs, fine white bread baked with wheat flour, fruit preserves made from orchard harvests, and sometimes, in wealthier monasteries, wine. The abbot often dined with guests, excusing himself from the standard monastic fare. While he remained under the rule, his role required a degree of flexibility. And yet this separation introduced tension. Younger monks might notice the disparity. The aroma of garlic roasting in oil, wafting from the guest kitchen, could stir more than just hunger, it could provoke reflection, resentment, doubt. But they rarely voiced it. The monastic garden, more than just cabbage. Behind every refectory meal stood a garden meticulously maintained, intensely observed, and deeply symbolic. The hortus provided leeks, onions, and garlic, the backbone of stews. Cabbage, beets, and turnips boiled until soft, then served with vinegar or oil when allowed. Herbs: sage, rosemary, thyme, parsley, dill, mint. These were culinary, medicinal, and ritualistic. Legumes: peas, lentils, and broad beans, dried and stored in clay jars. The act of gardening itself was part of the monk's spiritual life. It was physical labor rooted in humility, patience, and cycles. Monks worked without machines, using spades, hoes, and baskets. Each row planted was a quiet prayer. Each weed pulled, a kind of penance, preserving food for the long winter. Monasteries were, in a sense, self-contained ecosystems. To survive the winter or endure famine, they developed preservation techniques that seemed surprisingly advanced. Drying: fruits and herbs were dried on racks or hung in the rafters. Salting: fish, especially herring and eel, were packed in barrels with coarse salt. Pickling: cabbages and turnips were fermented in brine. Smoking: though meat was rare when permitted, it was smoked in small stone sheds. Cellaring: root vegetables were stored in cool pits, apples and pears kept in straw. The cellarer oversaw this entire process. He managed inventories, tracked spoilage, and ensured fairness in distribution. Without him, the monastery could starve. Silent feasts and subdued celebration. Despite their ascetic lifestyle, monks did observe feast days, though not in the way laypeople did. On days like Easter, All Saints, or the Feast of Saint Benedict, the menu might include spiced porridge with cinnamon or nutmeg, baked apples sweetened with honey, a third course, sometimes a rare delicacy like almond milk custard, or a pottage thickened with eggs if allowed. Even on these days the silence remained. No cheers, no toasts. Only extra bread. And perhaps for a moment, the sense that joy did not always need sound. Illness, old age, and the light diet. Monks who were ill or elderly were often placed on what was called the light diet, a flexible, personalized meal plan adjusted to individual needs. This might include warm goat's milk mixed with herbs, soft stews with more oil, broths enriched with garlic or onion, occasionally meat, especially if ordered by a physician monk. This exception reveals the practicality at the heart of the monastic system. Rules could bend when guided by charity or necessity. Health was sacred. A sick monk could not fulfill his duties nor maintain his prayers. So within quiet walls, kindness found expression in nourishment. Culinary copyists, recipes in the margins. While monks are known for copying Bibles and theological texts, they also preserved early cookbooks. In the margins of medical texts and agricultural manuals, scribes recorded notes on spice blends, instructions for pottage thickness, observations on fruit ripening, remedies combining food and healing herbs. Though they never set out to become culinary authors, these anonymous monks preserved the foundations of Western European cooking. Their restraint became our recipes. So can the soul find satisfaction in silence? Can the same stew, served every day, become something more than food? And is it possible that, in denying the world, the monks preserved more of it than they realized? In the dim silence of the refectory, the last meal of the day has ended. The plates have been wiped clean, the bread crumbs swept, the spoon placed on its shelf. The monks rise in silence and file out, their footsteps echoing across the cold stone floor like a procession of shadows. No one speaks. It has been this way for years, for decades, in some places for centuries. The daily act of eating, mundane, repetitive, and tightly controlled, was one of the most reliable aspects of monastic life in the 10th century. But its influence, surprisingly, reached well beyond cloistered walls. This final section explores the quiet legacy of monastic food culture, how ascetic eating shaped European cuisine, agricultural knowledge, and even the calendar itself. From routine to ritual, the purpose of monastic eating. By the 10th century, Benedictine monasteries had spread across much of Western Europe. In every monastery, the daily rhythm of eating was not just about sustenance. It was an act of submission to God, to order, to the body's limits. This wasn't accidental. In the eyes of the monk, the physical act of chewing, tasting, and swallowing was a sacred metaphor for obedience. The refectory was a place where even hunger bent to hierarchy. Food was not prepared for enjoyment. It was administered, timed, measured, and always aligned with the idea that the flesh must serve the spirit. This internal discipline, so repetitive as to seem unremarkable, was one of the most enduring structures in medieval religious life. Standardizing the calendar with the spoon. Ironically, one of the most enduring byproducts of monastic food culture was the calendar itself. Because fasting and feasting were tied to the liturgical calendar, monasteries became timekeepers for entire regions. Their need to know when Lent began, when saints' days fell, and when certain foods were allowed forced them to track seasons with precision. They recorded planting and harvest dates, moon phases, feast days, and solar movements in careful detail. These records laid the foundation for agricultural manuals, seasonal almanacs, and even early clocks. The desire to know when it was appropriate to eat cheese again contributed, indirectly, to the structuring of medieval time. Knowledge in the kitchen. Because monasteries were self-sustaining, monks developed sophisticated knowledge about crop rotation to preserve soil health, irrigation to maintain gardens year-round, herbology to combine healing and seasoning, food preservation through drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting. Much of this knowledge was written down not as culinary instruction, but as practical observation. The margins of theological texts and the final pages of herbals contain some of the earliest recorded recipes in the West. In preserving food, monks preserved knowledge. Silent innovation. Though monastic food was intentionally plain, it did not mean monks avoided innovation. On the contrary, within the limits of their rule, they experimented constantly. They bred hardier vegetable to withstand cold winters. They improved bread ovens, allowing for more even baking. They developed fish pond systems, ensuring a consistent supply of permitted protein. They maintained beehives for honey production, especially in monasteries that grew fruit for preserving. The desire for self-sufficiency led to unintentional agricultural advancement. And because monasteries exchanged letters and hosted traveling brothers, these ideas spread quietly, steadily across Europe. The cloister as cookbook. Later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, monasteries began to compile more formal documents detailing how food was to be grown, stored, and served. The roots of the medieval cookbook lie in these documents. But even by the 10th century, the oral tradition was strong. Young monks learned to cook from their elders, rotating weekly through the kitchen. These experiences taught not only manual skills, but spiritual lessons. How to measure without greed. How to serve without pride. How to endure without complaint. And in this way, the kitchen became a classroom, the stew pot a confessional. Feeding the poor, charity and food. Monasteries were also expected to feed the poor, the sick, and travelers. This wasn't optional, it was part of their religious duty. The kitchen often prepared extra portions of porridge or bread, distributed at the gate or through dedicated guest quarters. In this way, monastic food extended beyond the cloister. The poor ate monastic bread, pilgrims drank monastic ale, and occasionally nobles received monastic hospitality carefully calculated, never wasteful, yet surprisingly generous. This charitable dimension cemented the monastery's role not just as a spiritual refuge, but a social anchor. The paradox of simplicity. The longer monasticism endured, the more wealth monasteries accumulated through land grants, donations, and endowments. As a result, some monasteries in the later Middle Ages maintained lavish kitchens, vast cellars, and even herds of animals. But in the 10th century, simplicity was still the norm. There was no sugar, no chocolate, no tomatoes or potatoes. Spices were rare, mostly limited to local herbs. Meals were repetitive, spoons were shared. The cold was constant. And yet in this sparse environment, the values of order, consistency, and restraint flourished. The monks believed that in denying themselves pleasure, they created space for divine presence. That even in a bowl of bean stew, truth could be tasted. Echoes in modern food culture. Today, many of the foods we consider traditional European staples have monastic roots. Brown bread, once peasant food, was refined in monastic ovens. Beer, developed by monks, became a standard drink. Cheese, aged in monastic caves, evolved into complex regional varieties. Even vegetable stews, once signs of poverty, are now culinary comfort. The simplicity monks enforced on themselves became the foundation of regional identity. The ritual of the meal, once a religious act, became cultural heritage. The final spoonful. Picture the last monk at table. The reader has stopped. The bell has rung. The plates are stacked. He places his spoon down and bows his head. He has eaten beans again, the same bread, the same thin stew. He will eat it again tomorrow. And yet, through that repetition, he has tasted the rhythm of time. He has upheld a tradition older than most kingships. He has sustained not only his body, but a system that will, slowly, shape the very foundation of Europe's food and timekeeping. It was boring, it was sacred, it was enough. Story 5. Coal dust and paperwork. How the Industrial Revolution invented the middle manager. The factory whistles scream at dawn. In a damp English town clinging to the edge of a coal vein, smoke rises before the sun. The clatter of looms, the churn of pistons, and the hiss of steam blend into a new kind of urban symphony, the sound of industry. It is 1842. The Industrial Revolution is no longer a whisper, it is a roar. At the center of it all, amid the soot-covered children, the coughing coal haulers, and the humming gears, stands a man with a leather notebook and a pocket watch. He is not the owner, nor is he a laborer. He doesn't invent, dig, or sew. Instead, he measures, times, tracks, schedules. He is the middle manager, and he didn't exist like this before. This is the story of how the Industrial Revolution, through its insistence on standardization, volume, and efficiency, gave birth to one of modernity's most mundane yet quietly powerful roles: the person who organizes people for someone else. Before the office, management as a rare art. Prior to industrialization, most work was local, seasonal, and relatively self-managed. Artisans ran their own workshops. Farmers made decisions by the season. A master supervised a few apprentices. Authority was direct, visible, and personal. But the Industrial Revolution changed all that. It scaled production beyond the capacity of a single owner to oversee. Factories housed hundreds of workers, operated multiple shifts, and ran nearly 24/7. Decisions couldn't wait for the owner to walk the floor. And so emerged a new layer of oversight. Someone needed to translate the owner's expectations into hourly outcomes. These were the first factory overseers, timekeepers, clerks, and foremen. Together, they would slowly become the managerial class. Clocking the body. The key to industrial productivity wasn't just the machine, it was the measurement of time. Workers were no longer paid by task or season. They were paid by the hour, a radical shift in human labor history. And that meant someone had to track when workers arrived, note when they left, record how many minutes the machine sat idle. In early factories, this job often fell to a timekeeper, a man, almost always a man with a thick ledger, a pencil, and an unwavering stare. He stood at the gate each morning, marking late arrivals. He issued fines for lateness. He noted absences. He was both human spreadsheet and disciplinarian. In his wake came floor supervisors who didn't run the machines, but ensured others did. They carried checklists. They reported inefficiencies. They enforced the rules that weren't yet codified into HR policy but would be. The first paper empires. As production grew, so did paperwork. Owners demanded weekly updates. Bankers needed cost estimates. Suppliers asked for projections. Governments started asking for reports. And suddenly, factories needed clerks. These were often young men who could read and write, sometimes sons of artisans, sometimes promoted from the shop floor. They didn't sweat over furnaces or lift bolts of cotton. Instead, they managed inventories, payroll, supplier correspondence, work orders. Their work was invisible but essential. Without them, the machines had no inputs, the workers had no wages, the shipments had no labels. They were the nervous system of the new industrial organism. And as the clerks multiplied, they required coordination. A new role emerged: part clerk, part disciplinarian, part translator between capital and labor. The manager, the men between machines and money. The early middle manager was a strange creature. He was expected to understand machinery well enough to optimize usage, relate to workers, but maintain distance and authority, represent the owner's interests without sharing in ownership. He was rarely loved, often distrusted. To laborers, he was a spy, someone who timed bathroom breaks and recorded slowness. To owners, he was a tool, expected to maximize profit and minimize complaints. But the role was indispensable. Without him, large-scale production would collapse into confusion. He didn't invent the wheel, but he ensured it turned. Uniforms, language, and class. As the managerial role solidified, it developed a distinct identity. Clothing: managers wore cleaner clothes. Suits: ties, and hats became visual cues that they were not laborers. Speech, they adopted the formality of the upper class, avoiding dialects associated with workers. Behavior, they modeled punctuality, politeness, and efficiency virtues increasingly associated with capitalism. And yet they often lived beside the workers in modest homes near the factory gates. Their loyalties were split, their identities blurry. They were middle managers not just in function, but in life caught between two classes, respected by neither. The birth of scientific management. By the late 19th century, thinkers like Frederick Winslow Taylor would formalize this role into a philosophy: scientific management. Taylor believed that every action in the factory could be measured, timed, and optimized. Managers were no longer just overseers. They were engineers of behavior. They studied how long it took to load coal. They calculated the optimal height of a workbench. They divided tasks into micro-steps, removing individual judgment. The worker became a component, and the manager a calibrator. Taylorism spread from steel mills to textile plants, to offices, to schools. Management became not just a necessity, but a science and ideal of control through data. The middle manager was now a system, not a person. Resistance and adjustment. Unions despised this transformation. Workers resented being watched, measured, analyzed. Protests erupted, strikes flared. But owners doubled down. They defended middle managers as essential. They offered them small raises, modest offices, the illusion of authority. Slowly the role stabilized. By the turn of the 20th century, middle management was no longer a temporary solution. It was a career path. Universities began offering business degrees. Clerks could become supervisors. Supervisors could become factory managers. The dusty notebook had become a career ladder. So what happens to a man who manages machines but does not own them? Who carries responsibility but no power? And what does it mean to measure other people's time while never controlling your own? Up one flight of narrow wooden stairs above the din of clanging looms and the hiss of steam, a door creaks open to reveal a quiet, smoke-filled room. The factory office. Inside, a man in a slightly worn wool coat dips his pen into ink and begins to tally numbers in a columned ledger. Daily output, absenteeism, coal usage, fabric yards woven, minor injuries and lateness tallies. He is not a laborer. He is not a capitalist. He is a middle manager, and the page before him is both record and weapon. This section follows the growth of managerial culture in the 19th century. As systems of oversight expanded, the office replaced the workshop as the center of control, and a new kind of authority, one bound in ink and routine, emerged as the backbone of modern business. From factory floor to front office. By the mid-19th century, many factories had evolved into multi-level organisms. At the bottom were laborers. Above them stood floor supervisors, still visible among the smoke and steam. But higher still, increasingly separated, sat the office staff. These offices became centers of observation and control. Here, decisions were made not from experience, but from reports. Which machines needed repair? Which worker consistently underperformed? Which department exceeded quota? Managers rarely left the office unless summoned. Their authority came not from physical presence, but from their possession of data. This shift from watching people to watching numbers transformed the very nature of management. Paper as power. By 1870, the paper trail had become indispensable. Every part of the factory generated paperwork. Time cards, maintenance logs, order slips, delivery receipts, weekly tallies. Middle managers became paper shepherds, reviewing, organizing, and transmitting information upward to owners or downward to workers. More than overseers, they became translators of complexity. Their job wasn't just to enforce, but to make sense of thousands of small inputs. In doing so, they became irreplaceable, even if invisible. The discipline of documentation. With paperwork came discipline not just for workers, but for the managers themselves. They had to file reports by strict deadlines, avoid errors that might offend distant investors, monitor subtle shifts in productivity. Many managers kept private ledgers, fearing retribution for mistakes. They developed systems of cross-checking, copying, and backdating entries. The goal wasn't innovation, it was stability. And in a world of soot and danger, stability was the most prized currency. Surveillance as routine. To maintain control, managers relied on routines of surveillance. Walking the floor at set intervals, posting rules and penalty lists, requiring written excuses for absences, tracking work speeds with crude stopwatches. Some factories even installed panopticon-style layouts, where a central tower allowed supervisors to watch multiple departments at once. Early examples of architectural management. These measures weren't personal, they were procedural. Management became a form of institutional watching, where observation replaced engagement. Clerical identity and class division. Middle managers, while more privileged than laborers, did not belong to the elite. Their position was defined by respectable but modest wages, long hours, often longer than laborers, little job security, limited upward mobility. They occupied new social terrain, not noble, not working class, but something undefined, the white-collar man. This identity came with a certain stiffness. Middle managers adopted formal dress codes, polite detached manners, a reverence for process and punctuality. In some cases, they internalized their role to the point of over-enforcement, punishing workers not from malice, but from fear of their own failure. The manager's burden. With responsibility came anxiety. A delay in shipment could lead to reprimand. A dip in output might be interpreted as managerial incompetence, regardless of the cause. Unlike laborers who suffered bodily and owners who risked capital, managers suffered in silence under pressure from both sides, with little protection. Many drank, some aged quickly. Others became rigid adherents of rules, clinging to procedure as a kind of shield. They were not villains, but they were not saints either. They were instruments of a system still defining itself. Gender, education, and the managerial pipeline. As factories grew, more clerks were needed, and these positions increasingly went to literate boys from lower middle-class families. The role of education became central. Schools taught penmanship, arithmetic, and compliance. Students were trained to fill out forms, take orders, and follow office hierarchy. Meanwhile, women began to enter administrative roles in the late 19th century, mostly in textiles or communications industries, but few rose to managerial status. The middle manager remained, for now, a male domain, shaped by patriarchal structures. This pipeline from schoolboy to clerk to manager solidified the idea of professional progress tied not to ownership, but to obedience. Repetition as virtue. In management, innovation was dangerous, stability was prized. The best managers were those who delivered the same numbers each week, prevented problems rather than solved them, maintained smoothness rather than improvement. This ideal mirrored the machines they oversaw, reliable, steady, boring. Over time, companies began to rank managers based on quarterly performance, employee turnover, and waste reduction, formalizing a culture of metrics that persists today. To succeed as a manager was to disappear into the process. So what happens to the man who runs the machine without ever touching it? What becomes of identity when authority is borrowed, not earned? And in a system built on coal and carbon, what part does paperwork play in keeping the fire burning? By the closing years of the 19th century, the industrial skyline had changed. Factories had grown larger, urban centers denser, and smoke-stained brick buildings more imposing. But within them, a quieter revolution was taking place, not of engines or electricity, but of folders, ink, forms, and structure. The middle manager had become more than a practical necessity. He was now a pillar of the factory, a carrier of institutional memory, and a model for an emerging idea: the bureaucratic organization. This final section explores how the middle manager evolved from a bridge between labor and ownership into a full-fledged bureaucratic class, how the structure he operated within became formalized, scaled, and exported far beyond factories into offices, governments, and global corporations. From overseer to organizational spine. As industries expanded into national and multinational enterprises, the need to standardize operations across sites intensified. An ironworks in Manchester had to coordinate with a supplier in Glasgow, a shipper in Liverpool, and investors in London. This required predictable reporting systems, replicable processes, interchangeable personnel. Middle managers, once rooted in a single building, were now placed within branch systems, using identical paperwork, procedures, and internal hierarchies. They became the spine of organizational memory, carrying methods, values, and routines from one location to another. They trained new hires. They enforced consistency. They reported upwards and delegated downwards. They were no longer managing just labor. They were managing systems. The manager as a model. The bureaucracy, as envisioned by sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century, borrowed heavily from the role the middle manager had begun to inhabit. Clearly defined roles, a hierarchy of authority, impersonal rules and procedures, employment based on technical qualifications. Weber saw bureaucracy not as tyranny, but as a necessary response to complexity. And the factory manager, rule-bound, data-driven, results-oriented, became the template. No longer confined to industry, this structure took root in banks, railroads, insurance companies, government departments. The same man who once checked time cards by a gate now audited ledgers in a ministry or reviewed forms at a shipping company. Efficiency culture and the managerial ideal. By the 1910s, a new language had emerged around productivity. Output per hour, cost per unit, return on labor, cycle time. Managers began to speak in metrics, abstract representations of human work. This data mindset, honed in the smoky factory offices of the 1800s, now spread to boardrooms and planning departments. Middle managers were no longer just tools of production, they were expected to improve it. They initiated new workflows. They reorganized departments. They wrote internal handbooks. They didn't own capital, but increasingly they shaped how capital functioned. The illusion of authority. Yet despite this influence, middle managers remained in a paradoxical position. They exercised power but did not possess it. Their authority was delegated, always subject to review, and often limited to procedure, not policy. If they enforced unpopular rules, they were seen as petty tyrants. If they sympathized with workers, they were viewed as disloyal. Their job was not to lead, but to execute leadership's vision. And in many cases, their career had a ceiling. A lifetime of good service might result in a pension, a modest title, or a handshake, but never true ownership. The middle manager was the keeper of someone else's order. Bureaucracy as a culture. By the 1920s, even language began to shift. Report to management. Refer to the chain of command. Per company policy. These phrases emerged not from invention, but from decades of habit. The bureaucratic mindset was the natural outgrowth of managerial logic. Workers were no longer hired or fired at will. They were evaluated, scored, and processed. Companies published internal manuals. Department heads maintained performance charts. Middle managers became arbiters of compliance, not character. In this way, bureaucracy didn't just administer power, it became a culture of order. The global spread. The bureaucratic model, born of British factories and American steel mills, spread globally during the 20th century, especially through colonial administration and global business. In India, British railway managers instilled layers of reporting and centralization. In Japan, industrial hierarchies mimicked German and British management systems. In colonial Africa, European companies imposed bureaucratic structures on native labor. Everywhere it spread, the model relied on the same tools: paper trails, standardized roles, a middle class of compliant managers. These men became, in many cases, agents of empire, repeating the factory-born logic of control in plantations, mines, and shipping hubs around the world. Resistance from below and above. Of course, not everyone embraced the middle manager's rise. Labor movements decried them as enforcers. Intellectuals mocked them as unimaginative. Owners quietly resented their growing costs. Yet removing them proved nearly impossible. Complex operations required coordination. Capitalism demanded scalable predictability, and that meant managers. By the 1930s, their place was secure. From coalfields to cubicles, the middle manager was no longer a stopgap. He was the operating system of the modern world. The legacy of boring power. The most striking aspect of the middle manager's legacy is how invisible it remains. They rarely appear in textbooks. They aren't celebrated in monuments. They don't start revolutions or write manifestos. But they shape daily life more profoundly than many generals or kings. They enforced rules, maintained discipline, measured time, translated vision into action. In doing so, they defined how modern organizations move, pause, and repeat. Their power wasn't personal, it was procedural, it wasn't loud, it was quietly relentless. And in a world of increasing complexity, it was indispensable. Imagine now the manager sitting at his desk, tie loosened, reading the quarterly figures under gaslight. Outside, the factory doors close, the night shift begins, the world continues. He adjusts a number, makes a note, and stamps a form. Tomorrow he'll do the same. And in this repetition lies a strange kind of legacy, not heroic, not tragic, but utterly foundational. End of story 5. Coal dust and paperwork. How the Industrial Revolution invented the middle manager. Story 6. Dyes and disputes. The secret world of medieval textile guilds. The year is 1326. You are walking through the tightly packed streets of Bruges, Flanders. The morning air carries the sharp scent of dye vats, the dampness of woven wool, and the faint whiff of urine from fulling tubs. Behind thick timbered walls, hundreds of hands spin, stretch, soak, and beat cloth. The houses double as workshops. The city breathes in looms and exhales bolts of dyed fabric. And above it all, far above the clamor of laborers, sit the guild masters. Their names rarely make it into the chronicles, but they shape the rhythm of every textile city from London to Florence. These men, and rarely, but sometimes, women, run the most powerful economic engine of the Middle Ages: textiles. This is not a story of fashion. It's a story of control, of monopolies and dyes, of punishments for crooked seams, and of how guilds ruled towns not with armies, but with contracts, measurements, and cloth. The guild before the nation. Before modern nation-states consolidated power, Medieval Europe was a tapestry of city-states, bishoprics, and merchant towns. In many of these cities, true power did not lie with the king, the church, or even the mayor. It lay with the guilds. Guilds were professional organizations that controlled everything from who could produce goods to how they were priced, inspected, and sold. Among them, textile guilds were often the most powerful. Why? Because cloth was everywhere. Nobles needed it for prestige. Merchants needed it for trade. Farmers needed it for winter. Textiles were both everyday necessity and high-value commodity. To control textiles was to control the pulse of urban life. The layered world of cloth production. Textile production wasn't a single job, it was a sequence of highly specialized tasks, each controlled by a different guild or sub-guild. In cities like Ghent, Milan, or York, this process could involve shearers who prepared wool from sheep, carders who combed and aligned fibers, spinners, mostly women, who spun yarn, weavers who turned yarn into rough cloth, fullers who cleaned, thickened, and stabilized the fabric, often using urine, dyers who colored the cloth with plant or insect-based dyes, finishers who clipped, brushed, and pressed the fabric. Each group had its own rules, its own master, and its own conflicts. In many cities, these groups competed, despite being part of the same economic chain. The weavers might accuse the dyers of overcharging. The carders might claim poor quality wool. The fullers often stood accused of spoiling cloth during processing. The result was constant internal friction, overseen, and often exploited by the master guild. Entry and exclusion. To work legally in a city's textile trade, you had to belong to the guild, and membership wasn't easy. For a young boy, and occasionally girl, it might begin with an apprenticeship, 7 to 10 years of unpaid or barely paid labor under a master. After that came journeyman status, where one could earn wages but not open a shop. Only by producing a masterpiece, a perfect example of one's craft, could one hope to join the upper ranks. Even then, guild membership was not guaranteed. Many guilds imposed entrance fees, family lineage requirements, ethnic or religious exclusions. In several cities, Jewish, Muslim, and foreign-born workers were entirely barred from membership, regardless of skill. Thus, guilds were not just economic engines, they were tools of social control. Colors of privilege. In the medieval world, color wasn't just fashion, it was status. The most coveted dyes were also the most expensive. Tyrian purple, made from sea snails, associated with royalty. Madder red, extracted from roots, used for prestigious woolens. Woad blue, a cheaper alternative to indigo, but still complex. Cochineal and kermes, insect-based reds, very costly and labor-intensive. The dyeing process was difficult, smelly, and exacting. Dyers had to control temperature, timing, and chemistry without modern instruments. The dyers' guilds fiercely protected their methods. In many towns, unauthorized dyeing could lead to fines, whipping, or even banishment. Some guilds even used secret recipes, handed down orally or written in cipher. To hold dye knowledge was to possess economic leverage. Regulation, not competition. Unlike modern capitalism, medieval guilds did not promote competition. They promoted consistency. Guild regulations specified standard cloth widths, thread counts, acceptable dye levels, apprentice wages, number of looms per shop. Inspections were routine. Cloth could be stamped with a guild seal or burned publicly if found substandard. A single crooked seam could mean loss of license. This obsession with standardization helped make European cloth trusted across continents. Merchant caravans preferred Flemish woolens or Florentine silks because guild control made them predictable. Quality wasn't just craftsmanship, it was enforced law. The political power of thread. In many towns, textile guilds weren't just economic forces, they were political ones. They held seats on city councils, control over taxation policies, the power to call strikes, influence over laws concerning trade and property. In places like Florence, the Art della Lana wool guild effectively ran the city, rivaling even noble families in influence. And this power made the guilds deeply resistant to change. When new machines threatened their methods, guilds pushed back. When rural competitors emerged, guilds lobbied for protectionist laws. Progress was tolerated if it did not disrupt the hierarchy. So how did a single bolt of cloth carry such weight? What happens when control of color becomes control of commerce? And why, in a world so chaotic, did so many people place their trust in thread? It is a spring morning in 1381, and the gates of a London weaving house are locked. A group of apprentices, barely more than boys, stands outside, grumbling over unpaid wages and long hours. One tosses a stone. Another scrawls a crude mark on the wall. Inside, the master meets quietly with guild elders. They are not worried about the boys. They are worried about what's happening outside the city, where unregulated cloth is being woven, dyed, and sold without permission. The textile guilds are under threat. This section explores how the world of medieval textiles, once a carefully controlled network of power and procedure, was forced to defend its monopoly in the face of rising unrest, rural competition, and the slow, grinding pressures of change. Discontent from below. Guilds promise structure, stability, and protection. But for many, especially those at the bottom, the promise was hollow. Apprentices could toil for years without promotion. Journeymen might never afford guild membership. Widows, orphans, and non-citizens found themselves locked out of official work entirely, and many workers chafed under the weight of rigid rules, heavy fees, favoritism in advancement, guild taxes and fines. As towns grew, so did urban poverty, and many of the poor were skilled, yet unlicensed cloth workers. These excluded laborers began operating illicitly, creating black markets for textiles. In response, guilds launched raids on illegal workshops, confiscated cloth, and sometimes publicly punished offenders by flogging or exile. But suppression could only go so far. Discontent was growing. Rural cloth, the fraying edges of control. In many parts of Europe, particularly in England and the Low Countries, rural households began weaving cloth for sale, bypassing urban guilds entirely. This putting-out system involved merchants giving raw wool to peasants who spun and wove it at home. Finished cloth was then collected, dyed, and sold, often outside official channels. It was cheaper, faster, harder to regulate. Guilds called it illegal, claiming it undermined quality and tradition. But kings and nobles, interested in new revenues and cheaper exports, protected rural producers, especially in areas far from guild-dominated cities. This sparked a slow but growing war between urban monopolies and rural innovators. The English wool boom and the Flemish crash. One of the most striking examples of guild instability came with England's shift in the 14th century. England had long exported raw wool to Flanders, where skilled Flemish weavers turned it into fine cloth. But by the mid-1300s, English rulers realized they could keep the value at home. They offered tax breaks, protection, and even foreign weavers to establish English textile towns. This move devastated many Flemish guilds. Cities like Ypres and Bruges saw economic decline as their foreign trade dried up. Internal disputes over who was allowed to work grew fiercer. Some guilds turned violent. There were street brawls between journeymen and masters, arson attacks on illegal workshops, riots over new loom technologies that threatened jobs. Power, once so tightly woven, was beginning to unravel. The role of women, visible labor, invisible credit. In textile towns, women made up the majority of the workforce, especially in spinning, dyeing, and finishing. Yet guilds remained overwhelmingly male. Few women could become masters. Many were not even formally acknowledged as workers. Even when they owned looms, ran small workshops, or passed on skills to daughters, their names rarely appeared in records. Instead, they were recorded as wives of or helpers. But women were also harder to control. Some operated informal spinning circles. Others set up backroom dye tubs. Widows often continued their husband's business without license, especially if they had children to feed. Guilds viewed them as threats necessary for production, yet impossible to fully regulate. One guild ordinance from Florence complained of the swelling tide of unauthorized female weavers. It was not so much a gender issue as a control issue, and control was slipping. The guilds turn inward. Faced with external threats, guilds often turned their efforts inward, tightening membership requirements, increasing surveillance, and enforcing tradition with greater zeal. Some responses included mandatory watermarking of all cloth, public inspections with penalties for flaws, higher entrance fees, blacklists for those caught working outside the guild. But these defensive measures often had the opposite effect. They alienated workers further and pushed more production into unregulated spaces. Ironically, the more the guilds tried to preserve their past, the faster they accelerated the future, a world no longer dependent on centralized urban control. The seeds of decline. By the 15th century, signs of decline were clear. Merchant capital had begun bypassing guilds entirely. Cottage industries flourished in the countryside. Political backing shifted from guilds to crown-sponsored monopolies. Guild authority was increasingly symbolic. In cities like London and Lyon, guilds still wielded influence, but it was waning. The world was shifting toward proto-capitalism, driven not by tradition, but by scale, speed, and flexibility, none of which favored the rigid guild system. And yet, even as their political power faded, the guilds clung to their symbols, their processions, banners, feast days, and rituals. They remained institutions of identity, even if no longer of control. So what happens when an organization built on control loses its grip? How do you preserve a legacy woven into the fabric of cities themselves? And can a monopoly on cloth survive when the thread escapes the loom? By the early 1500s, the world of cloth was changing rapidly. Cities once ruled by guilds were now integrated into national markets, and new fabrics from distant continents were reshaping consumer tastes. Spices weren't the only goods coming east to west. Silk, cotton, and satin arrived in greater quantities, and with them came new labor systems, new dyes, and new economic rules. Still, the echoes of the medieval textile guilds didn't disappear overnight. Their institutions, customs, and even their language lingered long after their authority faded. They left behind more than just fabric, they left behind a structure, a worldview. In this final section, we'll explore the twilight of the textile guilds, their survival in surprising places, and how their insistence on quality, order, and local control still threads its way through modern labor systems. A slow fade, not a sudden collapse. The fall of guild power was neither sudden nor total. In many towns, textile guilds continued to operate for centuries, often reduced in influence, but still managing aspects of local trade. Their new role was largely ceremonial. They organized religious processions on feast days, maintained halls for community use, served as local charities, offering pensions to elderly members, preserved archives, libraries, and rules even when no longer enforced. By the 17th century, most governments, especially in England, France, and the Dutch Republic, viewed guilds with suspicion. They were seen as obstacles to innovation, free trade, and the state's direct authority over the economy. Laws were passed to limit their influence, monopolies were revoked, and yet, in a kind of bureaucratic afterlife, guilds endured. The print revolution and transparency. One of the unexpected forces that hastened the decline of guild secrecy was printing. In the late 1400s and 1500s, manuals on dyeing, weaving, and finishing began to appear in print, spreading knowledge that guilds once carefully guarded. These books detailed dye recipes, illustrated loom mechanisms, shared tips on stain resistance, fabric softening, and wool sorting. No longer chained to oral tradition or cryptic apprenticeship, textile knowledge became accessible, even global. As knowledge spread, guilds lost one of their primary sources of control: information gatekeeping. The rise of the merchant capitalist model. The merchant capitalist was the natural adversary of the guild. A man, or less commonly, a woman who wanted goods produced faster, cheaper, and without guild restrictions. Rather than working through guild channels, these merchants contracted directly with rural weavers and dyers, provided raw materials in bulk, paid piece rates per finished cloth, hired inspectors to ensure quality not based on tradition, but based on profitability. In doing so, they effectively privatized production, building early capitalist infrastructure without needing guild permission. This model would dominate cloth production well into the 18th century, setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution, where machines would replace looms and chemical dyes would replace roots and snails. The last bastions, guild resilience in Italy and Germany. While the Netherlands and England quickly dismantled their guild systems, other regions held on. In northern Italy, particularly in Florence, guilds remained active into the 18th century, aided by local pride, papal alliances, and integration with city governance. In southern Germany, guilds continued to manage apprenticeships, marriage approvals, and even housing disputes. These guilds adapted. They opened training schools, printed their own rules, incorporated more religious rituals to reinforce community. In these places, the textile guild wasn't just an economic unit. It was a civic identity woven into the very shape of daily life. Lasting legacy, quality control, and labor organization. Though guilds no longer control trade today, they left a permanent imprint on modern economic life. Their legacy can be seen in labor unions, which echo guild structures with elected leadership, apprenticeship pipelines, and internal codes. Certification systems like fair trade or organic, which mirror guild seals of quality. Local artisan movements, which reject mass production and invoke pre-industrial methods. Trademark and copyright law, rooted in the guild idea of protecting professional standards. Even modern job titles like master plumber, journeyman electrician, or craft guilds at artisan fairs are medieval echoes, survivals from a time when a stitch too wide could be grounds for punishment. Women's invisible threads reconsidered. While women were often excluded from official guild recognition, historians now recognize that their labor sustained entire cities. New research into wills, household records, and urban court cases shows women ran looms while their husbands traveled, taught textile skills to daughters, managed dye shops after widowhood, fought in courts for the right to finish cloth for sale. They may not have signed guild charters, but they shaped the craft quietly, expertly, and without credit. Modern textile collectives, particularly in post-colonial contexts, are now reclaiming these histories, reweaving women's labor into the narrative. The guild as symbol. Even long after their economic power dissolved, textile guilds remained potent symbols. Painters depicted them in elaborate civic portraits. Writers used them as metaphors for tradition, honor, and community. Revolutionaries, especially in France, burned guild records as symbols of old-world oppression. In some towns, guild halls still stand, now museums or cultural centers. In their afterlife, textile guilds became cultural artifacts, reminders of a world where power was measured in the width of a loom, the depth of a dye vat, and the strength of a seam. From warp and weft to wires and code, one final echo remains. The language of textiles persists even in the digital age. We speak of threads on online forums, fabric of society, networks woven across platforms, patterns in data, spinning information. We've replaced looms with machines and cotton with silicon, but the structure of process standardized, replicated, coded remains guild-like. Perhaps this is the true legacy, not cloth, but the idea that order, tradition, and human labor must be organized, stamped, and measured, even if the loom is now virtual. When a guild vanishes, does its thread still pull? Can we ever truly leave behind the patterns we once wove? And in a world of algorithms and automation, who now watches the seam?